The border flickered with tension, and Nigeria's generals knew it. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just pushing France out of the Sahel. He was redrawing the entire regional order, and Abuja was squarely in his crosshairs. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a power play dressed in sovereignty, and Nigeria, the self-appointed giant of West Africa, suddenly found itself on the defensive. The Alliance of Sahel States wasn't just a coalition, it was a declaration, and every move Traoré made sent a message loud enough to rattle the corridors of Aso Rock. He came for sovereignty, sure. But what no one expected was how fast he'd turn that sovereignty into leverage, and how quickly that leverage would become a knife at Nigeria's throat. Border security became the first battleground. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had sealed their northern frontiers with brutal efficiency, clamping down on militant flows and smuggling routes that once bled freely across the Sahel. On paper, that sounded like progress. But for Nigeria, it was a nightmare. The spillover they'd managed for years, the jihadists, the traffickers, the cross-border chaos, was no longer leaking into the desert. It was pooling at their doorstep. Traoré had effectively turned the Sahel into a pressure cooker, and Nigeria was holding the valve. Then came the resources. Gold, uranium, rare earth minerals, the lifeblood of the Sahel. And suddenly, AES was calling the shots. Traoré didn't just nationalize, he weaponized. Contracts with Western firms were torn up. New partnerships with Russia, China, and Turkey emerged overnight. And Nigeria, which had long positioned itself as the regional economic anchor, watched as billions in potential trade and influence slipped through its fingers. Worse, the message was clear. AES didn't need Nigeria's blessing. They didn't need ECOWAS. They didn't need anyone. That kind of independence, that kind of defiance, it was intoxicating to some, terrifying to others. Nigeria fell into the latter camp. Is this the turning point or just the opening act? Drop your take, because the friction only gets deeper from here. Traoré wasn't content with economic shifts. He wanted ideological dominance. His rhetoric, anti-imperialist, pan-Africanist, unapologetically militant, resonated across the region, especially among youth populations tired of old elites and stagnant governments. In Nigeria, a country already wrestling with internal fractures, corruption scandals, and a population hungry for change, Traoré's rise felt like a spark near dry grass. Abuja's leadership saw clearly. If AES succeeded, if Traoré proved that a small coalition could stand up to France, defy ECOWAS, and build a new Sahel order, then Nigeria's own citizens might start asking uncomfortable questions. Why can't we do the same? Why are we still bowing to the same powers? Why are our leaders so timid? And that's where the real threat lived. Not in borders or resources, but in perception. Nigeria had built its regional authority on economic size, military strength, and diplomatic weight. But Traoré was rewriting the playbook. He showed that courage, clarity, and calculated defiance could punch above weight class. He showed that a captain could outmaneuver presidents. He's built different, and the world just found out why. But for Nigeria, this wasn't inspiration. It was insurgency by example. Behind closed doors, Nigerian officials began framing AES not as partners, but as destabilizers. They whispered about security risks, about radical influence, about the chaos that could spill if the Sahel experiment collapsed. They leveraged ECOWAS to impose sanctions, to isolate, to pressure. But every sanction only hardened Traoré's resolve. Every threat only validated his narrative. Nigeria wanted to contain AES. AES wanted to replace Nigeria. So here's the question nobody's asking out loud yet. Can Nigeria afford to let Traoré win? And if they can't, what comes next? Because this isn't just regional rivalry. This is a fight for the soul of West Africa. And the opening bell just rang. What's your call? Is Nigeria's dominance over? Or is this just the beginning of a much longer war? Sound off, because the next move could change everything. The convoy rolled through the dust at dawn, and Nigeria's intelligence officers watched from across the border with clenched jaws. These weren't French troops anymore. These were AES soldiers, Burkinabe, Malian, Nigerian, moving in coordinated formations, running joint drills, sharing intelligence, building a military architecture that didn't include Abuja. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had done the unthinkable. He'd kicked out the French, and then he'd filled the vacuum himself. No consultations, no apologies, no permission. And for Nigeria, that silence was deafening. This wasn't just about sovereignty anymore. This was about who controls the guns, the borders, and the future of Sahel security. And Traoré had just answered that question without asking Nigeria's opinion. The message was brutal in its clarity. AES didn't need Nigeria's military umbrella. They were building their own, and it was pointed in every direction that mattered. What no one expected was how fast the Sahel would militarize under Traoré's watch, and how quickly Nigeria would realize it had been frozen out of its own backyard. For decades, Nigeria had positioned itself as the region's security anchor. When terror struck, Nigeria sent troops. When coups erupted, Nigeria brokered ceasefires. ECOWAS was their instrument, and military intervention was their card to play. But Traoré flipped the table. By reducing French military presence and replacing it with AES joint defense frameworks, he didn't just reject Western security, he rejected Nigerian dominance. The Sahel was no longer Nigeria's playground. It was AES territory, and the rules had changed overnight. Is this a strategic reset or the spark before the explosion? Drop your take, because the military posturing is only getting sharper. The troop movements told the story. Burkina Faso fortified its southern borders. Mali repositioned battalions closer to the Niger-Nigeria frontier. Niger tightened its eastern flanks, the same zones where Nigerian patrols used to operate freely. Joint AES exercises became routine, coordinated operations against militant cells, border sweeps, intelligence sharing that bypassed traditional ECOWAS channels. On the surface, it was counterterrorism. Beneath it, it was a declaration: we don't need you anymore. And for Nigeria's generals, that was more than an insult. It was a threat. Because here's the thing, when you're sidelined militarily, you lose more than influence. You lose intel. You lose early warnings. You lose the ability to shape outcomes before they spiral. Nigeria had relied on being plugged into Sahel security networks, on knowing what moved where and when. But Traoré had pulled the plug. Suddenly, Abuja was operating blind in a region it once dominated, watching AES build military coordination structures that deliberately excluded them. The mistrust wasn't hypothetical. It was operational. And it got worse. Reports surfaced of AES hosting Russian military advisors, Turkish drone instructors, and Chinese intelligence liaisons. Traoré wasn't just militarizing the Sahel, he was internationalizing it, bringing in powers that had no love for Nigerian hegemony. Every new partnership was a signal, every joint exercise a flex. He's built different, and Nigeria's starting to feel the weight of that difference. Behind closed doors, Nigerian defense officials began running scenarios. What if AES expands? What if they push south? What if the militant groups Nigeria's been fighting suddenly find sanctuary in AES-controlled zones? The questions weren't paranoid, they were tactical. Because Traoré's military posture wasn't defensive. It was assertive, confident, and unapologetically expansionist in vision. He wasn't just protecting Burkina Faso. He was fortifying a new regional bloc, and Nigeria was on the outside looking in. So the stakes became existential. If Nigeria lost military relevance in the Sahel, it lost leverage everywhere. ECOWAS would fracture further. Neighboring states would start hedging. Abuja's claim to regional leadership would crumble. Traoré wasn't just building an army. He was dismantling Nigeria's strategic architecture, one troop movement at a time. Here's the real question. Is Nigeria preparing to push back, or is it already too late? Because if AES keeps tightening its military grip, the Sahel won't just drift away. It'll become a rival power bloc. And when that happens, the confrontation won't be hypothetical. It'll be inevitable. What's your call? Can Nigeria reclaim its military edge, or has Traoré already won this round? Sound off, because the next move could turn mistrust into something far more dangerous. The phone call lasted 11 minutes, and by the time it ended, both sides knew diplomacy was dead. Nigeria's foreign minister had delivered the message with measured politeness. Concern over regional stability, appeals for dialogue, veiled warnings about unilateral actions destabilizing the West African order. On the other end, Burkina Faso's response was colder than expected. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't interested in reassurances. He wasn't interested in compromise. He was interested in sovereignty, and Nigeria's opinion on that matter was irrelevant. When the call disconnected, Abuja understood what it had been avoiding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a confrontation, and Traoré had already chosen his side. Publicly, Nigeria kept the mask on. Official statements spoke of brotherly concern, of shared regional challenges, of the need for unity within ECOWAS. But behind closed doors, the language was sharper. Diplomats scrambled to schedule meetings that were politely declined. Envoys arrived in Ouagadougou with proposals that went nowhere. Every attempt at dialogue hit the same wall: Traoré's refusal to bend, his refusal to acknowledge Nigeria's self-appointed role as regional mediator. And with each failed negotiation, the frustration in Abuja hardened into something darker. Nigeria wasn't just being ignored, it was being dismissed, and that stung in ways no public statement could admit. Is this diplomatic failure or strategic defiance? Drop your take, because the political fallout is only beginning to unravel. The real provocation wasn't just about words. It was about actions that rewrote the rules. Traoré's decision to nationalize Burkina Faso's gold mines sent shockwaves through the region. Foreign firms, some with Nigerian investors, some with ties to Nigerian intermediaries, watched their contracts evaporate overnight. AES wasn't asking for renegotiation. It was taking back control, and the message was unmistakable. African resources would serve African priorities, not external interests. For Nigeria, which had long profited from cross-border trade networks and partnerships with Western firms operating in the Sahel, this was more than economic disruption. It was ideological warfare. Then came the limits on foreign influence. Traoré didn't just reduce French military presence. He systematically cut ties with institutions Nigeria had helped build. ECOWAS protocols were ignored. Regional economic frameworks were bypassed. AES began negotiating bilateral deals with Russia, China, and Turkey, carving out a parallel economic and security ecosystem that didn't include Abuja. Every new partnership was a slap, every nationalization a provocation. Nigeria watched as the Sahel drifted further from its orbit, and there was nothing it could do except issue statements that no one in AES bothered reading. Behind the scenes, Nigerian officials tried everything. Quiet warnings were sent through back channels. Regional allies were mobilized to pressure AES. ECOWAS sanctions were floated, then imposed, then largely ignored. But Traoré had anticipated every move. He'd built alliances with Mali and Niger that were ironclad. He'd secured alternative revenue streams that made sanctions toothless. And most devastatingly, he'd captured the imagination of a generation tired of seeing their leaders bow to external pressure. Across West Africa, young people watched Traoré defy the old guard, and they liked what they saw. Nigeria wasn't just losing influence, it was losing the narrative. And that's where the real danger lived. Because when your policies are interpreted as provocative, when your sovereignty is seen as aggression, when your defiance becomes inspiration for others, you're no longer just a regional player. You're a threat to the established order. Nigeria had spent decades building that order, and Traoré was tearing it down with every decision he made. He's built different, and Nigeria's realizing it might not have the tools to counter him. So here's the question that keeps Abuja up at night. How do you negotiate with someone who doesn't need you? How do you pressure a leader who's turned isolation into strength? Because every diplomatic failure pushes Nigeria closer to a choice it doesn't want to make. Accept AES's rise and watch regional dominance slip away, or escalate and risk a confrontation that could fracture West Africa for a generation. What's your call? Can diplomacy still work, or has this already crossed into something irreversible? Sound off, Because the political strain is about to crack wide open. The map of West Africa was being redrawn in real time, and the architects weren't in Paris or Abuja anymore. They were in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, capitals that had spent decades in the shadow of larger powers, suddenly blazing with defiance that refused to dim. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had thrown down a challenge that went far beyond kicking out French troops. He'd proven that a coalition of smaller states could stand up, push back, and survive. And that proof was the most dangerous export West Africa had seen in generations, because now every frustrated population, every sideline nation, every leader tired of bowing was watching and wondering, if they can do it, why can't we? The realignment was already in motion. ECOWAS, the regional bloc that had held West Africa together for decades, was fracturing along fault lines no one could ignore. Nigeria pushed sanctions. AES ignored them. France threatened consequences. AES partnered with Russia and China. Every move escalated the stakes. Every countermove widened the divide. What started as a Sahelian rebellion against external control had become a full-blown contest for regional supremacy, and the old rules no longer applied. This wasn't just friction. This was the beginning of a new West African order, and no one knew who'd be standing when the dust settled. Is this the future of African sovereignty or the prelude to regional collapse? Drop your take, because the implications are spreading fast. Economically, the damage was already visible. Trade routes that had connected the Sahel to coastal markets through Nigeria were disrupted. Cross-border commerce slowed as tension simmered. Nigerian businesses with investments in AES states watched their access evaporate under sanctions and political hostility. But AES wasn't bleeding out the way Abuja expected. Traoré's pivot to alternative partnerships cushioned the blow. Russian grain and military hardware flowed in. Chinese infrastructure deals accelerated. Turkish drones patrolled Sahelian skies. What Nigeria thought would be economic isolation turned into geopolitical diversification, and that terrified every old power watching from the sidelines. Because here's what they realized. AES wasn't just surviving outside the Western Nigerian sphere. It was thriving. Gold revenues were redirected from Paris to Ouagadougou. Resource contracts were renegotiated on African terms. The Sahel was no longer a backwater. It was becoming a proving ground for a new kind of African agency, one that didn't ask permission and didn't apologize. And for global powers accustomed to dividing influence in West Africa between France and Nigeria, this was chaos. The neat arrangements that had kept the region predictable were unraveling, and unpredictability meant opportunity for some, disaster for others. Strategic alliances became the new currency. AES tightened ties with non-Western powers eager to challenge old hegemonies. Nigeria leaned harder into its partnerships with the West and ECOWAS loyalists, trying to shore up a crumbling coalition. The Sahel became a chessboard, and every move reverberated across the continent. Ghana watched nervously. Senegal hedged its bets. Côte d'Ivoire calculated which side offered more stability. The entire region was choosing teams, and the choice carried consequences that would last decades. But the volatility wasn't theoretical. It was kinetic. Border skirmishes increased. Militant groups exploited the power vacuum created by competing security architectures. Economic disruptions fueled grievances. And beneath it all, populations radicalized by poverty, corruption, and broken promises looked at Traoré's defiance and saw something intoxicating. Proof that change was possible. He's built different, and that difference is reshaping West Africa faster than anyone anticipated. Here's the reality no one wants to say out loud. This isn't ending anytime soon. AES won't back down. Nigeria won't concede influence. France won't walk away quietly. And global powers won't ignore a region suddenly up for grabs. The Sahel has become the flashpoint for a prolonged contest of influence, and every side is digging in for a fight that could define West Africa for the next generation. The question isn't if this gets worse, it's how bad it gets before someone blinks. So what's your call? Does this realignment strengthen Africa's sovereignty, or does it fracture the region beyond repair? Sound off, because the next chapter is already being written, and it's going to reshape everything you thought you knew about power in West Africa.